I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Well, amid growing calls to address what is being referred to as a mental health crisis in Canada, today's medical segment will focus on the connection between your mental health and your physical health. Now, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association, there are multiple correlations between mental health and chronic physical conditions, which can significantly impact a person's quality of life. Now, this in turn could add more strain on our already struggling healthcare system. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into this in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back.
Great to be here, Nima.
Now, we often talk about how diet, drinking, and a lack of exercise can impact your physical health, but how does the way you think impact your body? Just how powerful is this brain-body connection, Dr. Raut?
Well, it's an extremely powerful brain-body connection. What we do know is people living with mental illness will face a range of physical symptoms as a result of the illness, but also as a consequence of treatment as well. So mental illnesses can alter hormonal balances, sleep cycles, and many psychiatric medications have also side effects from weight gain to irregular heart rhythms. So the way people experience their mental illness can really increase their susceptibility for developing poor physical health. Think about the impact of social and cognitive function, giving you decreased energy levels, which can then impact the way you adopt healthy behaviors. People can then lack motivation to take care of their health. They can adopt unhealthy eating and sleeping habits, smoking or substance abuses as well. So what we do know is Canadians on a whole, if you're a Canadian and you report symptoms of depression, you are more than likely to have 3 times as many chronic physical conditions as someone in the general population.
All right, Dr. Raut. And what kind of physical illnesses are directly connected to mental illnesses as well?
Right. So I think it's surprising to people when we see the list of conditions that can affect you when you have a mental health illness. For an example, just using Canadian data alone, what we do know is if you have depression, you're about 1.6 times more likely to get things like diabetes, heart disease, and even 3 times more likely to have a stroke overall. And we see this with other mental health diagnoses as well, much higher percentages of COPD and cancers such as breast, colon, and lung cancer.
Some very concerning information there, Dr. Raut. Now, what about just everyday stress? What sort of impact could that have on your physical health?
Right. So the longer the stress can last, the worse it is really for your mind and body. Chronic stress can cause a lot of changes in your body from things like overeating or bad habits, but also with high demands of a job. The low decision-making latitude is associated with things like increased coronary artery disease, for example. Increased stress also can cause issues such as lack of social support, which again is implicated in a host of mental issues there. Surprisingly, chronic stress can also weaken the immune system, and you can actually have changes in type 1 cytokines, protective T cells in our body, which as we talked about the many cancers above, those deficiencies can actually decrease our ability to fight those tumors or even heal wounds.
Wow, Dr. Raut, lots of interesting information there. Now, something to consider is that advocates are saying we're in a mental health crisis here in Canada, but at the same time, we're experiencing a healthcare staffing shortage. So have you been seeing a rise in patients needing treatment for physical illnesses that are connected to mental health?
Yeah, we're absolutely seeing this rise in physical illnesses, especially those connected with mental health. Many of our patients who have mental health issues are presenting with the significant issues like diabetes and stroke, and not to mention chronic joint pains and chronic fatigue in our healthcare system.
And how do you see this impacting the healthcare system overall?
Well, it's very apparent the system's been under a lot of pressure. Some might argue this pressure has been there far before the pandemic. But to put on top of that, the pandemic, RSV, influenza, long COVID, and now these increased physical illnesses, I think we're playing a difficult game of Jenga right now.
Oh, definitely. Now, a quick 45 seconds left here, Dr. Rao, but what are some simple steps that everyday Canadians can take to better address their mental health?
Right. So I think it's definitely hard to prioritize mental health on a daily basis. And like we discussed, it's incredibly important to do so, though. So taking that time to relax every day, whether it's meditation or yoga, something to do without alcohol and without screens, without looking at your phone, is probably the most practical activity you can do on a daily basis, even if it's for about 10 minutes there.
Always helpful advice. Dr. Rao, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, coming up, we're going to take a look at recession fears and the economy. Canada's Associate Finance Minister warns of uncertain economic times in 2023. Our conversation with Dr. Moshe Lander from Concordia University is up next about the likelihood of a recession and what it would look like. Associate Finance Minister Randy Boissonnault says this year will be a turbulent and uncertain one for the Canadian economy. Speaking to reporters at the Liberal cabinet retreat in Hamilton today, the Edmonton MP insisted the government still has some spending room for big priorities, including a new health care deal with the provinces. A recent report from the Business Council of Canada and law firm Bennett Jones warned that the Liberal fiscal forecast was likely too rosy. The cabinet retreat comes amid high inflation, warnings from some economists of a potential recession, and major job losses in the tech sector. Well, with us now to discuss all this is Dr. Moshe Lander, economics professor at Concordia University. Dr. Lander, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hello.
Now, the outlook here seems to be pretty grim. We're hearing this even from the Bank of Canada governor. But it seems that the federal government is thinking quite optimistically, at least when it comes to their political commitments. So what is your takeaway from all of this, Doctor?
So it's probably a little bit of both. They do have room to spend on healthcare. The type of long-term investments that they're talking about usually pay themselves off in the long run. But the problem is, you're right. Their projections for what GDP growth will look like, the risk of a recession, they're probably a little too optimistic. And they don't update those often enough the way that the Bank of Canada or private sector forecasters would. And so they're probably working on a little bit of an outdated view as to how resilient the Canadian economy is.
Now, meanwhile, as you mentioned, economists are debating the likeliness of a recession in 2023. What have you been hearing about this?
Yeah, I mean, if we see a recession, right, that's, a slowdown in GDP and in fact, negative growth. I think even if we see that, it's probably not going to be the type of recession that Canadians are used to experiencing. Contracting GDP is usually accompanied by jumps in unemployment. But 6 months ago, we were talking about businesses were desperate to find workers. We had job or help wanted signs all over the windows. I think what they'll do this time is if we do experience a recession, they'll just take those help wanted signs out of the window and just say, I'm good with what we've got. They had a hard enough time finding a lot of these workers in the first place. I don't think they want to let them go and then have to try and find them again. So I don't know that we'll see necessarily the economic devastation that usually comes with recessions.
All right. Well, amid these certain uncertainty of a recession in 2023, can you tell us a little bit more about the key indications of a recession and if any of these indications can be seen in Canada right now?
So I think the big one is going to be that if there is a recession here, it's going to be triggered by that rapid increase in interest rates. The anticipation that there's an increase coming tomorrow even would be the eighth one in about 13 months. So if we do get tipped into a recession, probably the indicator of bad times coming are going to be a rise in personal bankruptcies, business bankruptcies, delinquencies, and some signs of stress from consumers being able to meet their debt obligations. And so we've already seen a little bit of that, but it's not necessarily flashing in the way that would indicate that there's a really bad recession coming. But of course, those interest rate increases take about 18 months to work their way through the economy. And the big increases came in the middle of 2022. So we've still got a little bit of time to see if there's those real warning indicators that something's not right.
All right. And building on that, we know, as you mentioned, the interest rate hike is expected to be tomorrow, 0.25 percentage point. All of this to wrestle inflation. But have these interest rate hikes that we've been seeing throughout 2022, have they had any impact on inflation at all?
So they have been working. And like I said, it takes about 18 months to work their way through. So if you imagine that those first increases, which came early in 2022, were only 25 basis points, even the occasional 50 basis points, they still haven't had their maximum impact. But we've seen inflation come from 8.1%, I think, in June last year to now 6.3%. So even without the full impact, we're seeing that there is an easing of inflation. Will it get down to 2%? Well, if the increase tomorrow is 25 basis points, the projection seems to be that that's needed to get us to 2% 18 months from tomorrow. So we should be circling our calendars for mid-2024 for when we can say mission accomplished.
All right, Dr. Lander. So how do you see all of this impacting the quality of life and the rising cost of living in Canada during 2023 itself?
So it's going to be another rough year. I think that workers are going to try and negotiate with employers for higher wages. And I think the pushback is going to be that time has passed, right? That inflation is on its way down and the Bank of Canada has done what's necessary to get us back there. So if the pushback is, no, you're not going to get it, then I think 2023 could be another lost year in terms of purchasing power, that we're going to see consumers see another drop of 4%, 5% in their purchasing power. Couple that with the drop last year of another 4 or 5%, kind of hurts a little bit. But the good news is that if productivity remains strong, we can recover a lot of those losses in 2024, 2025. And in a few years' time, this will just be a blip in the highway of life rather than the pothole that we seem to think it is right now.
Always good to end on a positive note. Dr. Lander, thank you again for joining us today.
Anytime.
After the break, we'll take a look at mental health and stigma. Our conversation with Dr. Patrick Corrigan is up next. Toronto Mayor John Tory is calling for a national summit to address what he calls Canada's mental health crisis. He's calling on Canada's mayors, ministers, premiers, and the Prime Minister to take part in this summit to discuss how better to support people living with mental health and addictions challenges. Today, January 25th, is also Bell Canada's Let's Talk Day. However, talking about it might not be that easy. According to the Mental Health Commission of Canada, 60% of people with mental health problems or illness won't reach out for help in fear of being labeled. Well, joining us now to talk more about the importance of mental health and overcoming the stigma associated with it is Dr. Patrick Corrigan, a U.S.-based author and mental health advocate. Dr. Corrigan, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the topic of mental health is really coming to the forefront, especially following the pandemic, or at least the height of the pandemic. What have you been hearing from other professionals regarding this shift?
I think everybody's concern about mental health challenges increasing is right on. In some ways, the pandemic was a perfect storm. There was the stress related to it and the sickness and death people experienced. There was the staying in place, being separated from your support network and your mental health providers. Together, it's clear that mental health challenges are increasing throughout Canada.
It is. It's very clear. Now, in terms of your research in particular, we know you look into the stigma associated with mental health. So has the stigma also shifted following the pandemic as mental health is being more talked about?
Well, stigma about anything has gone up a lot through the pandemic. We wrote a paper that suggested that people involved in concerned about COVID were likely to be viewed more negatively. Actually, the social distancing thing, while it was an essential way to deal with the pandemic, it probably made stigma worse because it's sort of the message you need to stay away from these people. When you combine the existing stigma of mental illness is quite significant with this new one. The experiences people had are even worse.
And from your research, what have you found to be the best ways to address this sort of stigma in society, or at least help a patient deal with the stigma?
Well, there's big picture issues and there's small picture issues. The big picture issues is the way to change stigma is really not through education. It's really not going around saying mental illness is a brain disorder. We haven't changed white attitudes about Blacks by going around educating people about it. It's people coming out. It's people telling their stories of recovery. It's learning that, in fact, people can achieve their goals and overcome their symptoms and learn how to live with it quite successfully. And the only person who can do that is a person with lived experience. What does that mean for the individual? I am not necessarily saying your viewers should go out and disclose automatically. I think they should be judicious about it. They may want to find someone who is safe, supportive, hopeful, who you can disclose to and share your stories. So you're not living with it all by yourself. Of course, mental health providers do that. But on top of that, it's anybody in your support system, your faith-based community you can reach out to.
Talking about it really helps. Now, your work also analyzes the impact of community and personal contact within the recovery of mental illness. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what that looks like?
Yeah, that, again, what I was just saying, if I might use an analogy, one of the ways we changed attitudes about the LGBTQ movement was not educating people about the fact that they're normal. It's about 20, 30, 40 years ago they came out. And so the brave people doing that really changed the dialogue. So at the community level, the degree to which some people decide to come out at work or come out in their faith-based community or extended family is a way you'll really tear down stigma, because you'll look at them and say, hey, they're a lot like me.
All right, Dr. Corrigan, looks like we've just got about a minute left here, but we mentioned Mayor John Tory is calling for a national summit to address mental illness in Canada. So what are some pillars for officials to consider when implementing this national mental health care plan or strategy?
Two, one is it's all about recovery. It's not all about being sick. The reality is we should be hopeful that people can overcome their mental illness. And the second thing is choice and power lies with the person with the mental health challenge. We don't want to swoop down, grab a bunch of people and cure them. We want to reach out to the community and find out what they think the best way to cure them. And community is a great word for it, because community is a diverse group. And so white people have one approach, people of color have another approach. You have to make sure you involve and encourage all those people to speak up.
All right, Dr. Corrigan, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we'll take a look at the planned comeback for Zellers across Canada this spring. Our conversation with retail analyst Bruce Winder up next. Well, after a 10-year hiatus, Zellers is making a comeback this spring with 25 locations across Canada. But one retail expert says the chain needs a lot more than nostalgia to appeal to today's consumer. The stores are set to be located inside select Hudson's Bay department stores. Hudson's Bay Company says 5 of the locations will be in Quebec, 9 sites have been allotted to Ontario, and 4 will be in BC. Another 5 locations will be in the Prairies, and 2 will be in Nova Scotia. But amid inflation, high interest rates, and the rising cost of living, Bruce Winder, author of Retail Before, During, and After COVID-19, says the revived chain needs to offer both value and price points that connect with today's consumer. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Mr. Bruce Winder himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on the program.
So, as we mentioned, the chain seems to be focusing a lot of its marketing on nostalgia and appealing to those who remember Zellers, the restaurant, the red color theme, etc. But how much of that same Zellers store plan or setup will be seen in these new chains? What can we expect?
Well, my understanding, based on what the company announced, is that we'll see part of it, but not that much. There isn't really discussion of a restaurant, and the stores are going to be about 8,000 to 10,000 square feet, which is just a fraction of the original Zeller size. And we're really going to be looking at categories, just a few categories: baby, toys, pet categories, and home decor. So just a fraction of the categories that you would have seen in a Zeller store.
Definitely sounds like just a fraction. Now, are there any new elements of this revival of Zellers that may appeal to the modern consumer?
I'm not aware of any. We really have to see sort of what happens in terms of what products they're launching, what prices they're launching. I guess the one thing that would be new to consumers, Zellers consumers, is an online presence. So, a lot's changed in 10 years, and the new Zellers under the Bay will have a website, and they have a pretty state-of-the-art distribution center in the Toronto area that can handle a lot of products quickly using robotics. So that's going to be probably one of the big differences, is Zellers is sort of caught up as it relates to e-commerce.
All right. Well, going back to your previous comments on price points and products that match the traditional value that consumers expect, can you tell us a little bit more about this and what exactly this would look like, especially for Zellers?
Well, I think it's going to be a real tough one, because if you look at, the competitive set has changed a lot in 10 years. You've got Walmart, who just got incredibly strong. You've got Costco, you've got Dollarama, Dollar Tree, Amazon. These have all become serious retailers in the discount segment, the value segment. So Zellers, if they're going to come back in at that price point, sort of the value price point, it's going to be tough because they only have 25 stores. And the way retail works is the more quantity you buy, the lower price you get. So it'd be pretty hard to imagine them competing with those retailers I mentioned previously.
And on that point, we know Zellers was shuttered about 10 years ago and replaced with Target for a very short 2-year period. Can you tell us what led to these shutdowns previously and how this revived Zellers can avoid this?
Yeah, it's a good point because there's a reason why Zellers closed. Now, luckily, they were sold to Target, which was a great payday for them. But Zellers was sort of on a spiral downward, anyways. I used to work at Zellers for a couple of years, and the company was magical back in the '80s. But it just, as soon as Walmart came in '94, it just kept taking market share from Zellers, just because Walmart was run better. They had better prices, better assortment, bigger scale, better everything. So Zellers was sort of on a slow trajectory downward.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question pertaining to your research in particular. How does the evolution of consumerism during and following the pandemic play into the relatively traditional space of brick and mortar and department stores and supercenters like Walmart, Zellers, and Superstore, as you mentioned?
Well, you know what? We're changed. Consumers changed a lot during the pandemic, and now the consumer is sort of being hit by a freight train, which is really, inflation, high interest rates, job loss in the tech sector, probably more job loss, stock market's down. So it's going to be a real tough time, and this means consumers are looking for more value. They've cut back spending. They're going to continue to cut back spending. They're going to buy more private label products. More of their money's being chewed up, pardon the pun, at grocery stores. So they have to find ways to cut back in other areas that affect the retailers you mentioned.
All right, just about 30 seconds left here. But what are you particularly keeping your eyes on as Zellers prepares for its relaunch?
Well, the biggest thing I'll be looking at is the assortment. I'll be looking at the price point. I'll be looking at the assortment, the quality, the specification of the items, how big it is, what kind of signage is there, what kind of advertising, and of course, how they link it all into e-commerce. So I'll be curious to see what their go-to-market strategy is.
All right, Mr. Winder, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or make sure you could follow us on our social media accounts. We're available on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also find all our news interviews on our YouTube channel, the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.